Nobody screams like that unless they've already lost hope. The words left Ethan Hayes' mouth in a low murmur as the storm rattled the windshield of his rusted cargo crawler. Acid rain hissed against the armored glass hard enough to blur the lights of the arena district ahead. Neon signs flickered through the downpour like dying stars, painting the muddy wasteland in streaks of red and blue. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering controls as another distant cry echoed through the night. Female. Terrified. Human colonies weren't supposed to allow pit arenas anymore. Not officially. But Frontier Worlds had their own rules once the suns went down. Especially on Karen 9. The crawler's engine groaned as he guided the heavy vehicle beneath a corroded overpass. The smell of burnt coolant and wet metal filled the cabin. Somewhere beyond the storm, thousands of voices roared in excitement. Ethan already knew what that meant. Betting night. He should have kept driving. That would have been smarter. Safer too. But then the scream came again, sharper this time, followed by the deep mechanical howl of arena gates opening. Ethan cursed under his breath and killed the engine. Rain instantly swallowed the silence. He stepped outside, boots sinking into inches of oily mud. Cold droplets struck his dark jacket and steamed faintly against the thermal fabric. The arena loomed ahead of him like a giant rusted furnace buried into the rock. Massive floodlights cut through the storm while crowds packed the upper platforms beneath glowing shields. Ethan kept his head low as he moved toward a maintenance entrance near the lower pits. Nobody paid attention to one more working-class drifter in a mining jacket. Not here. Not in this part of the galaxy. The moment he slipped inside, heat slammed into him. Thick, humid, smelling of sweat, ozone, and frightened animals. Metal corridors vibrated under his boots as spectators pounded against the rails overhead. Ethan followed the noise until he reached a graded viewing platform overlooking the pit itself. Then he froze. A woman knelt alone beneath the pouring rain. Chains hung from her wrists, glowing faint blue against pale silver skin. She wasn't human. She was taller than most Terrans, her soaked white hair clinging to her shoulders while a cracked restraint collar pulsed around her throat. Even from 30 feet away, Ethan could see exhaustion in the way she held herself. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Golden, sharp, proud despite the fear buried underneath. Around her lay broken cages and scattered bones from previous hunts. The crowd screamed for blood above them. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Move. A handler barked nearby, shoving another creature crate toward the arena doors. This one survives tonight. She breeds tomorrow. Laughter erupted around the corridor. Ethan's jaw hardened. He looked back toward the chained alien woman just as she lifted her head toward the storm. Their eyes met for half a second, and somehow, through all the noise, all the rain, all the madness of that place, she looked more tired than afraid. The arena lights suddenly dimmed crimson. A warning siren blared through the chamber. Somewhere beneath the floor, something massive began moving. The crowd erupted into cheers. The woman closed her eyes slowly, as if preparing herself for the inevitable. Ethan exhaled once. Long, heavy. Then his hand moved toward the plasma rifle hanging against his back. The floor beneath Ethan's boots trembled again. Slow. Heavy. Mechanical locks clanged somewhere below the pit while steam poured from vents along the arena walls. The crowd above began chanting in uneven rhythm, their voices distorted through old speakers crackling with static. Ethan ignored them. His eyes stayed fixed on the woman kneeling in the rain. She had not moved, not even when the first containment gate started opening. Most people begged in moments like this, screamed, bargained, but she only lowered her gaze toward the flooded concrete as if she had already accepted whatever came next. Ethan hated that look. He had seen it before on evacuation ships during the Titan food riots. People stopped fighting long before their bodies gave out. A handler brushed past him carrying a shock prod over one shoulder. You planning to watch or place a bet? The man sneered. Ethan said nothing. The handler laughed and leaned against the rail overlooking the pit. Pretty thing, huh? VA Sora bloodline. Worth more than this whole district if she survives. Ethan finally glanced at him. Why chain her? The man grinned through crooked yellow teeth. Because they always run. Another metallic roar echoed through the chamber. The final gate began lifting. A cold draft rolled out from the darkness beneath the arena floor, carrying the smell of wet fur and stale blood. Spectators surged against the barriers overhead, waving credit chips and shouting numbers into wrist communicators. Ethan felt something twist in his stomach. This was not survival anymore. It was entertainment. Down in the pit, the woman slowly raised her head. Rainwater streamed across the glowing marks near her collarbone. The restraint around her neck flickered weakly blue with every breath she took. Then Ethan noticed her hands. Trembling. Barely. She was afraid. She was just hiding it better than anyone he had ever seen. A deep growl rolled from the darkness below, low enough to vibrate through the metal walls. Several workers immediately stepped back from the railing. One muttered a nervous curse under his breath. Ethan tightened his grip on the rifle strap across his shoulder. "Open the floodlights," someone shouted through the intercom. Bright white beams slammed down into the pit. The creature emerged slowly from the shadows beyond the gate. Massive, four-legged, covered in black armored plates that reflected the rain like oil. Its eyes glowed pale silver beneath a skull-shaped face, while steam drifted from its nostrils into the cold air. The crowd exploded with excitement. The woman did not move. She only stared at the beast with exhausted eyes, like she had done this before. Ethan's pulse hammered once against his ribs. The handler beside him chuckled. 3 minutes, he said casually. That is my guess. Ethan looked at the chains around her wrists again, then at the creature inching closer through the rain. Something inside him snapped quietly into place. Not rage. Not heroism either. Just certainty. Before the handler realized what was happening, Ethan grabbed the man's shock prod and slammed it into the control panel beside the railing. Sparks burst across the console. Sirens screamed instantly throughout the arena. The restraint locks around the woman's chains flickered. The handlers stumbled backward shouting curses while guards turned toward the noise. Ethan pulled the plasma rifle from his back in one smooth motion. The sound alone cut through the arena like thunder. For the first time all night, the woman's golden eyes widened in surprise. Ethan stepped onto the railing above the pit, rain soaking through his dark jacket as alarms flashed red across the chamber. Then he looked directly at her and spoke with calm certainty. "When those chains open," he said, "run." Everything happened at once after that. The chains around the woman's wrists released with a sharp metallic snap, just as the arena guards began shouting over the alarms. Red emergency lights spun across the chamber, staining the rain and concrete in flashing crimson. Ethan jumped from the railing into the pit below, boots slamming hard against the flooded ground. Cold water splashed around his legs as the beast lifted its massive head toward him. Up close, it looked even larger. Steam rolled from beneath its armored plates, while silver eyes locked onto the rifle in Ethan's hands. The crowd above fell strangely quiet. Nobody had expected a human to enter the arena willingly. Ethan slowly stepped between the creature and the woman. "Move," he said without looking back at her. "North Tunnel. Now." For a second, she did not obey. Ethan could feel her staring at him through the rain. Confused. Suspicious. The kind of disbelief that came from someone who had spent too long around cruel people. Then the beast let out another low growl and lunged forward. Ethan fired instantly. Blue plasma lit the storm in violent flashes while the impact forced the creature sideways into the arena wall. The crowd erupted into chaos. Some screamed in excitement. Others shouted for security. Ethan did not wait to see what happened next. He grabbed the woman gently by the arm and pulled her toward the maintenance tunnel beneath the stands. "Run." This time she moved. Fast. Bare feet splashed through shallow water as they disappeared into the narrow service corridor behind the pit. Metal doors slammed shut behind them while sirens echoed through the rusted structure. Ethan kept his rifle raised as they ran through steam-filled hallways lit by flickering emergency strips overhead. Somewhere behind them came heavy impacts against reinforced gates. The beast was still alive. Of course it was. Frontier arenas never used weak animals. "Left," the woman suddenly said, breathing hard. Ethan glanced toward her in surprise. "You know this place?" "I know cages." Her voice carried no anger, just exhaustion. They turned sharply into another corridor moments before armed guards stormed through the previous junction. Ethan pulled her behind a stack of cargo crates while flashlight beams swept across the hallway. He could hear security teams barking orders through comms. "Locate the human male. Protect the asset." "Asset." Ethan looked toward the woman beside him. Rainwater dripped from strands of white hair framing her face, while the glowing collar around her throat pulsed faintly in the dark. She kept one trembling hand pressed against it, as if she hated the thing touching her skin. Ethan lowered his rifle slightly. "Can you walk?" She looked at him with clear irritation despite everything happening around them. "I have been running beside you for half a mile." Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. The guards moved farther down the corridor. Their voices faded. Silence returned except for distant alarms and the hiss of old ventilation pipes. For the first time since entering the arena, Ethan finally got a proper look at her. She was beautiful in a way that did not feel fragile. Sharp cheekbones, golden eyes that missed nothing, grace hidden beneath exhaustion. But what stayed with him most was the expression on her face when she studied him back. Not fear anymore. Calculation. "Why?" she asked quietly. Ethan frowned. "Why what? Why risk your life for someone you do not know?" Ethan leaned against the cold metal wall and checked the remaining charge in his rifle. 43%. Not great. Because they chained you up and called it entertainment. The woman stared at him for a long moment. Then her gaze slowly lowered toward the weapon in his hands. "You are not what they told me humans were," she whispered. Somewhere deep within the arena structure, another heavy roar echoed through the pipes. Closer this time. Ethan lifted his rifle again immediately. The woman's eyes widened slightly as the overhead lights flickered. Then the ventilation shaft above them bent inward with a loud metallic groan. The ventilation shaft exploded downward in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Ethan grabbed the woman by the wrist and pulled her aside just before something massive crashed onto the corridor floor. The entire hallway shook beneath the impact. Steam burst from broken pipes overhead, while red warning lights flickered violently through the smoke. The beast rose slowly from the wreckage, silver eyes glowing through the haze. Up close inside the narrow corridor, it felt less like an animal and more like a machine built to hunt. Water dripped from the black armored ridges along its spine, while its breathing rattled through the metal walls like distant thunder. Ethan lifted the plasma rifle instantly. "Run," he said again. But the woman did not move this time. Instead, she stared at the creature with a strange expression Ethan could not read. Recognition, fear, shame. The beast lunged forward suddenly. Ethan fired twice in rapid succession. Blue light flashed across the corridor as the impacts forced the creature backward into the wall. Metal panels crumpled inward beneath its weight. Ethan did not wait for another charge. He grabbed the woman's hand and sprinted deeper into the maintenance tunnels while alarms screamed above them. They moved through twisting corridors filled with steam and flickering lights. Ethan's lungs burned from the heat while his boots pounded against grated flooring slick with condensation. Behind them came the sound of claws scraping metal. Still following. Of course it was. "This way," the woman said sharply, turning into a side passage barely wide enough for both of them. Ethan followed without hesitation. The corridor narrowed until exposed cables brushed against his shoulders. Finally, they reached a sealed utility room hidden behind stacks of broken equipment. The woman slammed the emergency hatch shut while Ethan forced a rusted locking bar into place. Silence crashed down around them except for their breathing. Ethan stood still for several seconds with the rifle aimed at the door, waiting, listening. Somewhere outside, heavy footsteps passed through the corridor beyond the wall, then slowly faded into the distance. Ethan lowered the weapon carefully. The room smelled of dust, machine oil, and old rainwater. One weak overhead bulb flickered pale yellow across rows of abandoned generators. The woman leaned heavily against the wall, breathing hard. For the first time since the arena, Ethan noticed the dark bruises circling her wrists beneath the broken restraints. His jaw tightened slightly. "Sit down," he said quietly. She looked at him with immediate suspicion. "I do not need help. You are shaking. I am not weak." Ethan crouched near an old supply locker and pulled out a faded thermal blanket, still sealed in plastic. "Never said you were." He tossed it gently toward her. The woman hesitated before catching it against her chest. The soft silver material reflected faintly beneath the broken lights. She stared at it as though she had forgotten what kindness looked like. Ethan sat across from her beside the wall and checked the rifle battery again. 31%. Not enough if security teams found them before sunrise. He exhaled slowly and rubbed rainwater from his face. Across the room, The woman finally wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. The movement looked strangely careful, almost unfamiliar. "What is your name?" she asked after a long silence. Ethan glanced toward her. "Ethan Hayes." She lowered her eyes briefly before answering. "Liriath Va Sora." The name sounded ancient. Noble. Ethan could almost hear generations behind it. Another distant roar echoed through the tunnels far above them. Liriath flinched before she could stop herself. Ethan noticed. He pretended not to. After several quiet seconds, she spoke again in a softer voice. "That creature was not hunting me because it was hungry." Ethan looked up immediately. The yellow light flickered across her golden eyes as she touched the glowing restraint collar around her throat. "It was trained to bring me back alive." The room fell silent again after her words. Somewhere beyond the walls, old pipes groaned beneath the weight of the storm outside. Ethan sat motionless against the generator casing while the weak overhead bulb flickered across Liriath's face. She kept one hand resting lightly against the glowing collar around her throat, as if she could feel every pulse inside it. Ethan had seen tracking restraints before on prison transports near the outer colonies, but this one looked different. Smaller, more advanced. Thin silver lines moved beneath its surface like living circuitry. "What does it do?" he asked quietly. Liriath looked down at the device for several seconds before answering. "It measures my pulse, hormones, stress levels, fertility markers." Ethan frowned immediately. "That sounds illegal." A bitter smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Only on civilized worlds." The rain outside intensified, rattling faintly through the ventilation shafts overhead. Ethan watched her carefully. There was no self-pity in her voice. No tears either. Just exhaustion layered over old humiliation. Like someone who had repeated the same nightmare too many times to fear it anymore. Liriath slowly adjusted the thermal blanket around herself. The silver fabric looked strangely soft against her bruised wrists. "My species values bloodlines above everything," she continued. "Especially female bloodlines." Ethan leaned forward slightly, elbows resting against his knees. "So they sell women into arenas?" "No." Her golden eyes lifted toward him. "They sell women like me." The room seemed colder after that. Ethan glanced away for a moment, jaw tightening hard enough to ache. Frontier worlds always found new ways to make monsters out of ordinary people. Sometimes with weapons, sometimes with money. "Bride seed," Liriath said softly. "That is the closest translation in your language." Ethan looked back at her. "What does that mean?" She hesitated before answering. "It means my body is considered valuable enough to belong to governments instead of myself." The words settled heavily into the silence between them. Ethan stared at the cracked floor beneath his boots for a long moment. Then he quietly removed the combat knife from his belt and stood. Liriath immediately stiffened. Fear flashed across her face before she buried it again behind cold composure. Ethan noticed anyway. Slowly, carefully, he crouched beside her. "Relax," he murmured. "I am looking at the lock." Liriath stayed perfectly still as Ethan examined the restraint collar around her throat. Up close, he could see tiny coded symbols moving beneath the silver plating. Corporate markings, auction tags, tracking frequencies. His stomach turned slightly. "These people tagged you like cargo," he said under his breath. "Because that is what I became." Ethan slid the knife carefully beneath one damaged panel. Sparks flickered softly as the blade lifted part of the casing away. Liriath inhaled sharply but did not move. "This might hurt," Ethan warned. "I know." He worked slowly, fingers steady despite the failing light. Outside the room, distant alarms still echoed through the tunnels. Security teams were searching. The beast was searching too. But for several quiet minutes, none of that mattered. Ethan focused only on the damaged restraint beneath his hands while Liriath sat silently wrapped in the silver blanket beside him. Her breathing slowed little by little. Then suddenly the lock gave way with a soft metallic click. The blue light around her throat disappeared instantly. Liriath froze. One trembling hand slowly touched bare skin where the collar had been moments earlier. Ethan pulled the broken restraint away carefully and tossed it onto the floor beside him. Neither of them spoke. Liriath stared at the shattered device like she no longer recognized the feeling of freedom. Then something unexpected happened. Her shoulders shook once. Barely noticeable. Ethan realized with quiet surprise that she was trying not to cry. She lowered her head quickly before he could pretend to notice. But Ethan had already seen enough. "Hey," he said gently. Liriath did not look up. Ethan hesitated for half a second before placing his jacket beside her instead of putting it back on. "You are not property anymore." Liriath stared at the broken restraint lying on the floor as though it might suddenly reactivate and snap back around her throat. The faint blue glow inside the shattered collar flickered twice before finally dying completely. Silence settled over the utility room again, heavy and unfamiliar. Ethan leaned back against the generator beside the sealed hatch, watching the dim hallway light beneath the door for movement. Nothing yet, but he knew better than to trust quiet places on frontier worlds. Quiet usually meant something was waiting. Across from him, Liriath slowly pulled his jacket closer around her shoulders. The dark fabric looked oversized against her slender frame, the sleeves hanging past her hands. Ethan pretended not to notice the way she held onto it. "Humans do this often?" she asked softly after several minutes. Ethan glanced toward her. "Do what? Risk themselves for strangers?" He gave a tired shrug. "Not enough." Liriath studied him carefully in the flickering light. "Where I come from, kindness is usually transactional. There is always an expectation attached." Ethan rested his head briefly against the cold wall behind him. "Yeah, Earth has plenty of people like that too. Then why are you different?" The question lingered between them longer than Ethan expected. Outside the room, thunder rolled faintly across the storm above the city. Ethan rubbed one hand over his face before answering. "Because somebody should be." Liriath looked away after that, golden eyes lowering toward the cracked floor panels. Ethan could almost see the conflict moving behind her expression. Distrust fighting exhaustion. Survival instincts fighting hope. He understood that look more than he wanted to admit. "You were military," she said quietly. Ethan frowned slightly. "How can you tell?" "The way you move." Her gaze lifted toward the plasma rifle beside him. "The way you watch doors before conversations." Ethan let out a small breath that almost sounded like laughter. "Used to fly rescue transports for the Frontier Corps." "Used to." He stared at the dim emergency light overhead for a moment before answering. "A mining company ignored evacuation orders during a radiation storm 3 years ago. I went in anyway." Liriath listened silently. "I brought the workers home alive," Ethan continued. "The company lost billions because I exposed what happened." A faint bitter smile crossed his face. "Turns out corporations do not like heroes unless they are profitable." Liriath tilted her head slightly. "So they punished you for saving lives." "Pretty much." Another silence followed, softer this time. Less guarded. Ethan noticed Liriath watching him differently now. Not like prey studying a possible threat. More like someone trying to understand a language she had never heard before. Suddenly, a low mechanical click echoed through the hallway outside. Ethan instantly grabbed the rifle and stood. Liriath rose beside him without hesitation, the thermal blanket slipping from one shoulder. Both of them stayed perfectly still. Another click. Closer this time. Then came the unmistakable sound of scanning drones moving through the corridor. Red search beams swept briefly beneath the crack under the hatch. Ethan lowered his voice to almost a whisper. "How many exits does this room have?" Liriath moved toward the back wall immediately. "Maintenance shaft." She pointed toward a narrow opening half-hidden behind old machinery. "Leads beneath the city." Ethan looked toward the hatch as the drones paused outside the room. Metal claws scraped lightly against the door. His grip tightened around the rifle. Liriath stepped closer beside him, close enough for him to feel the warmth of her shoulder through the cold air. "Ethan," she whispered carefully, "if they catch us, they will not kill me." Ethan looked at her. The fear hidden inside her voice hit harder than any scream from the arena ever could. Then the locking mechanism on the hatch slowly began to turn from the outside. The lock turned another inch. Slow. Deliberate. Ethan raised the plasma rifle toward the hatch, while Liriath moved behind him without being told. The room suddenly felt much smaller than before. The weak yellow light overhead buzzed softly, while rainwater dripped somewhere deep inside the walls. Outside the hatch came the faint, mechanical clicking of security drones scanning the corridor. Ethan's pulse slowed instead of rising. Training did that sometimes. Fear became focus. He glanced once toward the narrow maintenance shaft hidden behind the old machinery, barely wide enough for one person at a time. "When I open that path," he whispered, "you crawl and do not stop moving." Liriath's expression hardened immediately. No, Ethan frowned without taking his eyes off the hatch. This is not a debate. I will not leave you. The certainty in her voice caught him off guard. Another metallic click echoed outside as the locking wheel shifted farther open. Ethan lowered his voice even more. Liriath, listen to me carefully. They want you alive. That gives you a chance. You do not understand, she whispered sharply. If they take me back, I will disappear forever. Ethan finally looked at her then. Really looked at her. The fear inside her eyes no longer came from death. It came from losing herself again. The hatch suddenly slammed once from the outside, hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling. A distorted voice echoed through the metal. Open the door and surrender the Viesura asset. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose. Asset, he muttered bitterly. The voice continued. The human male will not be harmed if he cooperates. Ethan almost laughed at that. Almost. Instead, he stepped backward toward the maintenance shaft while keeping the rifle trained on the hatch. Get ready. Liriath moved closer beside him. Ethan, he cut her off gently. You trusted me once already. Do it again. For half a second, she looked like she wanted to argue. Then the hatch groaned violently as external tools forced against the locking bar. Time was gone. Ethan reached behind the machinery and pried open the narrow shaft entrance. Cold air rushed upward from the darkness below the city. The tunnel disappeared into blackness beneath tangled pipes and cables. Go, he ordered softly. Liriath hesitated only long enough to grab his wrist. Her fingers were cold from the storm, but steady now. Why are you doing this? She asked one final time. Ethan stared at her for a heartbeat while warning lights flashed red across the room. Then he answered with complete honesty. Because somebody should have done it for you a long time ago. The hatch exploded inward behind him in a shower of sparks. Security drones rolled into the room first, their red scanners sweeping across the walls. Ethan fired instantly. Bright plasma lit the cramped chamber while smoke filled the air. Move, he shouted. Liriath disappeared into the shaft at last, just as armed figures stormed through the ruined doorway. Ethan backed toward the opening while firing controlled bursts to slow them down. The room echoed with alarms, metal impacts, and shouted commands. Then suddenly another sound drowned everything else out. A deep animal roar. Close. Too close. Ethan's blood ran cold. The beast crashed through the corridor behind the security teams in a blur of black armor and silver eyes. Chaos erupted instantly. Guards scattered. Drones slammed into walls. Ethan used the confusion immediately, dropping into the maintenance shaft feet first before sealing the hatch above him with an emergency lever. Darkness swallowed him. He hit the lower tunnel hard, boots splashing into freezing water nearly knee-deep. For one disorienting second, he could hear nothing except his own breathing. Then a pair of glowing golden eyes appeared in the darkness ahead of him. Liriath reached out through the shadows and grabbed his hand before he could even stand fully upright. And for the first time all night, Ethan realized she had been waiting for him instead of running away. The underground tunnel smelled of rust, rainwater, and old electricity. Ethan followed Liriath through the darkness while freezing water splashed around their legs with every step. Pipes lined the low ceiling overhead, dripping steadily into the flooded passage below. Somewhere far above them, muffled sirens still echoed through the arena district. But down here the city sounded distant. Hollow. Forgotten. Liriath kept hold of Ethan's hand as they moved through the maze beneath Karen 9. At first he thought she was simply guiding him through the dark. Then he realized something else. She had not let go even after they were safe. Ethan glanced toward her as faint blue emergency lights flickered farther ahead in the tunnel. Her silver-white hair clung damply against the jacket draped around her shoulders while her golden eyes stayed alert, scanning every shadow around them. But her grip on his hand remained steady, trusting. The realization settled strangely in his chest. How much farther? Ethan asked quietly. There is an old transit station ahead, Liriath replied. No one uses it anymore. Her voice sounded calmer now. Softer too. They continued through the tunnels for another several minutes before the passage finally widened into a massive underground chamber buried beneath the city. Broken train rails stretched into darkness while old holographic signs flickered weakly across cracked walls covered in rust stains and dust. Ethan exhaled slowly. Looks abandoned enough. Liriath released his hand at last and moved toward an old maintenance terminal near the platform edge. The moment her fingers brushed the console, dim overhead lights flickered to life one row at a time, casting pale silver illumination across the station. Ethan stared at her. You know old transit systems too? A faint, tired smile touched her lips. When you spend years escaping cages, you learn many things. Ethan sat heavily against one of the broken support pillars, exhaustion finally crashing into his muscles all at once. His shoulder ached from recoil strain, while cuts across his hands still stung from the shattered collar earlier. Across the station, Lyriath quietly searched through storage containers for supplies. For several minutes, the only sounds were distant thunder and the soft hum of failing generators. Then Ethan noticed something strange. Lyriath had gone completely still beside one of the old terminals. What is wrong? He asked immediately. She looked back toward him slowly, her expression unreadable. Someone activated a city-wide search grid. Ethan stood at once. For you. For us. She turned the dusty monitor toward him. A security alert flashed across the cracked screen beside grainy images from the arena. Ethan recognized himself instantly. Wanted for terrorism. Harboring protected property. Interference. With corporate breeding contracts. Ethan stared at the screen for a long moment before shaking his head with quiet disbelief. That might be the worst thing anyone has ever called me. To his surprise, Lyriath laughed softly. The sound was small and brief, but real. Ethan looked toward her in mild shock. There it is, he murmured. What? Your first actual smile. The laughter faded from her face almost instantly, replaced by something quieter, more vulnerable. She stepped toward him slowly across the empty station until only a few feet separated them. Ethan, she said carefully. There is something I must tell you before dawn comes. The seriousness in her voice made his stomach tighten slightly. Okay. Lyriath lowered her eyes for a moment as though searching for courage. Then she looked directly at him beneath the pale station lights. Among the Viesora people, she said softly, a male who shields a hunted female with his own life is not considered a stranger afterward. Ethan frowned slightly. What is he considered? Lyriath's golden eyes shimmered faintly in the dim light as she answered. Lifebound. Ethan blinked once. The old station suddenly felt very quiet around them. Lyriath took one slow breath before continuing in a voice barely above a whisper. In your language, the closest meaning would be husband. For several seconds, Ethan could only stare at her. The old transit station hummed softly around them, while rain thundered far above the underground city. Pale silver lights flickered across Lyriath's face as she stood motionless a few feet away, his dark jacket still wrapped around her shoulders. There was no teasing in her expression, no manipulation either, only honesty, quiet and terrifying in its sincerity. Ethan slowly exhaled and rubbed one hand across the back of his neck. That is a lot to put on a guy before breakfast. To his surprise, Lyriath smiled again. Small, genuine. The kind of smile that transformed her entire face for half a heartbeat before sadness touched her eyes once more. I am not asking anything from you, she said softly. I only believed you deserved to know what your actions mean to my people. Ethan looked down, briefly at the cracked station floor beneath his boots. He had spent most of his life around noise. Engines, cargo ports, military barracks, rescue sirens. But somehow this silence between them felt louder than all of it. And what happens now? He finally asked. Lyriath stepped beside the broken platform edge and looked toward the dark tunnel stretching into the distance. At sunrise, the Viesora fleets will begin searching this sector. Ethan frowned slightly. To rescue you? Her expression darkened. To reclaim me. The difference in those words hit him immediately. Ethan moved beside her, resting both hands against the cold rail overlooking the abandoned tracks below. You think they will put those chains back on you? I know they will. Ethan stared into the darkness ahead while distant thunder rolled beneath the city. Somewhere during the last few hours, protecting her had stopped feeling like a decision. It felt automatic now. Necessary. He hated that realization because it scared him more than the arena ever had. Then we leave before they arrive, he said simply. Lyriath looked at him in surprise. You would abandon your world for someone you met tonight. Ethan let out a tired breath that almost sounded like laughter. Karen, 9 stopped feeling like my world a long time ago. Before Lyriath could answer, the station lights suddenly shifted from silver to bright white. Both of them froze instantly. A deep mechanical voice echoed through hidden speakers overhead. Unregistered vessels entering city airspace. Ethan's pulse tightened. Lyriath slowly stepped toward one of the cracked terminal screens near the platform. Her golden eyes widened slightly as multiple signals appeared across the old radar display. Massive ships, dozens of them. Sleek silver signatures descending through the storm clouds above the city. Ethan stared at the screen. Those are not arena security ships. Lyriath's voice dropped almost to a whisper. No. The entire station trembled faintly as engines thundered somewhere overhead. Then another message appeared across the damaged monitor in glowing alien script. Ethan could not read it, but Lyriath could. He saw the emotion hit her. Instantly. Shock first, then disbelief, then something dangerously close to tears. What does it say? Ethan asked quietly. Lyriath looked at him slowly, her voice trembling for the first time since he met her. It says the House of Viesora has invoked an ancient protection right. Ethan frowned. Meaning? Lyriath stepped closer until only inches separated them beneath the pale station lights. Meaning they are not searching for stolen property anymore. Her fingers gently closed around his hand again. Warm this time. Certain. They are searching for the human who protected me. Somewhere above the city, thunder shook the station as enormous ships descended through the storm. Ethan looked down at their joined hands for a long moment before lifting his eyes back to hers. Lyriath did not look afraid anymore. Just tired. Hopeful. Human, somehow. And in the silence beneath that broken city, while rain hammered the world above them, Ethan realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The beasts had hunted her body. The galaxy had hunted her bloodline. But all she ever wanted was for someone to finally protect her heart.